And the thing they were saying, completely unprompted, was if it was not for zero gravity, I would not have been able to achieve X, Y, Z. So there was students who used the platform who'd grown up on council estates. They were the first person in their family to go to university. And it's that attribution that sort of kept me going over that period. Even when we had no money, we weren't generating revenue. So I sort of froze on live radio in front of a couple of 100,000 people. I knew I couldn't change the world overnight. When I graduated from university, I was 21 years old. I only had 200 quid left from my student loan. That was my startup capital.
Welcome to Kasa Connect. Together we're exploring the journeys of entrepreneurs, creatives and change makers shaping the future. Today's guest is on a mission to provide opportunities to students who don't have them. From a small town in West Yorkshire to graduating Oxford and starting the company Zero Gravity that has raised millions, he's now on Forbes 30 Under 30. I'm so excited to have Joe on today's episode of Kasa Connect. I want to jump straight into it because it's so impressive. You got into Oxford, one of the top universities in the world. How did you make that happen and what was your experience like?
Well, I'm 28 years old now, so in many ways my journey started 28 years ago, and I grew up in a small town in the UK called Morley, which is a sort of suburban post-industrial town between Leeds and Wakefield in the north of England. I grew up in a single-parent family, which was difficult. My mum was a speech therapist working full-time in the NHS, and trying to bring up 3 kids at the same time. And even though it was difficult, in part, I think my mum instilled some real core values, hard work, resilience, trying to make the most of your talents. And I was always someone who was academic and motivated, so I did well at school. But it was almost a completely arbitrary moment that took me on my journey to Oxford, because no one in my family had been to Oxbridge before. And it was actually, the ambition was piqued for the first time on GCSE results day, where I was one of those unfortunate kids that the sort of school put forward to be interviewed on live radio. And I was interviewed on BBC Radio Leeds opening my results. And luckily I got a good set of results, but the radio interviewer asked me live on air, Joe, with this set of results, you're going to think about applying to Oxbridge, and how do you feel about that as a northerner from a state school? And because their ambition had never been something I'd thought about before, I was completely flummoxed by the question. So I sort of froze on live radio in front of a couple of 100,000 people, which was embarrassing at the time. But that moment was the thing that just very arbitrarily made me think, maybe I could give this a go. So I gave it a shot. It was difficult. I was not very prepared. I didn't know what to do, how to comport myself, how to navigate a completely alien process. But I was lucky to win a place, and I haven't looked back from there.
That's amazing, and I'm sure it took a lot of hard work. And you decided to study philosophy, politics, and economics. How come you decided those subjects?
Well, I was never somebody who had such a deep burning passion for one subject that I wanted to completely specialise. So I wanted to keep myself broad, and to put it in quite cliched terms, I just wanted to understand the way the world worked. I think often when you're a kid growing up in a small town in the north of the UK, you feel like almost the world happens to you rather than you influencing the world. So I thought the only way I can change that is actually by understanding all of these kind of impersonal forces that seem to be shaping my life. And I thought doing that degree was the best route to do it. But it was a crazy transition going from growing up in a small northern town to Oxford, because suddenly I was heading down south to a university with a very different demographic to the place I'd grown up in. And the sort of imposter syndrome that comes with that is obvious and well spoken about. I think what people don't touch on quite so much is almost like the accumulated guilt that you also have sort of transitioning from one sort of community and way of life to another, where like my friends and family back home almost sort of felt like I was betraying my roots. People making jokes about, you're going down south to be with the poshos, you're going to be going on skiing holidays now, are we going to actually ever see you? And it was all good natured, but underneath was a real, I think, pain, which is the great thing about being socially mobile and being able to do things that were impossible for your parents' generation is obviously all of the kind of economic success that comes out of that. But the painful thing is often you have to sort of socially shed your skin to move into a new form of life. And that can be painful and lead to identity challenges, and not just in terms of where you're going, but also what you're dislocating yourself from as well.
And you're also founder of Zero Gravity now, an incredible company doing so much to help, young students. And those students like you who didn't actually ever consider Oxford.
Yeah.
Tell me more about that. When did you kind of get the idea and that kind of purpose that this is what I want to do?
Well, in many ways, I was solving a problem that I'd faced firsthand. Now, in the UK, if you come from a low opportunity background, you're 6 times less likely to go to a top university than someone from an affluent background. And everyone knows these stats. The gap between the sort of have and have-nots in any developed economy is pretty stark. But in the UK in particular, the sort of what we call social mobility, which is just a technical fancy phrase for can you actually do better in life than your parents, that has been stagnant for 40 years now. So I'd faced that problem firsthand. I had sort of the lived experience of it. And my hypothesis was, when I finished university, I wanted to solve this problem, but I thought that the sort of proprietary, unique solution I had was essentially to try and build technology to break that link between background and opportunity. Now, to someone like you, that probably sounds pretty intuitive, but back in 2018 when I started, no one was actually thinking about how to use tech or digital to solve this problem. Now, you had government doing on-the-ground stuff in schools, you had universities busing academics across the country to do sort of classroom talks. Employers would maybe do internships, but they would be sort of concentrated in the particular area they were located. No one was building technology to try and reach talented people in low opportunity areas and actually provide them with the ongoing support you need to actually go on that crazy journey like I did. I'm not kind of optimistic or naive enough to think there's one single thing you can do to change someone's life trajectory from sort of stagnating in their ambitions versus going on a crazy journey like me. There's no one single thing. It has to be ongoing, consistent support. And the beauty of digital is if you're able to build a fantastic experience that people can access anytime, anywhere through their mobile phone, you can actually achieve that. So that was my hypothesis back in 2018. But I knew I couldn't change the world overnight. When I graduated from university, I was 21 years old. I only had 200 quid left from my student loan. That was my startup capital in many ways. So I knew I couldn't change the world overnight. So I just started in my bedroom trying to build a very basic app to not get everyone into all the great universities or careers at the beginning. At the beginning, I just tried to get people into Oxford and Cambridge and tackling that small slice of the problem that I'd faced firsthand. But I thought tactically, if I can prove it works here, I can then scale it elsewhere. And that's how I started at the beginning.
And you taught yourself to code and everything to build the app?
Yeah, so I had self-taught coding skills probably from around the age of 13. So I sort of was obsessed with technology and all this great innovation coming out of Silicon Valley. It's difficult being from our generation not to be inspired by technology. When you grow up with the sort of iPhone and then Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp, Uber Deliveroo, all these sort of category defining apps. And I wanted to sort of be part of that. But living in Morley in West Yorkshire, it sort of felt a long way away from Silicon Valley. But the way I sort of taught myself was in the old school way of, you buy the book, HTML for Dummies style book. And I just learned initially how to build basic websites. And it's not like I was some kind of genius coder. I had sort of very intermediate level skills, but I knew just enough to be able to sort of get by, get along, build an MVP. And nowadays, I don't write a single line of code. But having enough of those skills to actually get going and build something is the way you can actually get that proof of concept before you finally go all in and actually create something that can scale.
Did you get a lot of support for the app really quickly and a lot of investors, or was that a tricky journey?
So if you read my story online, it probably looks like a traditional overnight success, but it was actually a year from launching Zero Gravity before I was even able to pay myself a salary, let alone hire employees or have an office or do all of these things which on paper kind of signify having a proper professionalized organization. So the first 12 months was really, really tough. It was completely bootstrapped and self-funded. And I had to do various things on the side to sort of get the income streams to stay afloat. But what I was able to create over time was traction. I was able to sign up users who actually engaged with the platform, used it, and actually got attributable results. Now, there was students who used the platform who'd grown up on council estates. They were the first person in their family to go to university, and they were winning offers at all of these top universities, not just Oxford, but other top universities as well. And the thing they were saying, completely unprompted, was, if it was not for zero gravity, I would not have been able to achieve X, Y, Z. And it's that attribution that sort of kept me going over that period. Even when we had no money, we weren't generating revenue. It was the fact that we had a small cohort of users who genuinely loved the product that made me think, there is something here. And it might not be easy to scale. It might require a hell of a lot of hard work to do it. But I know the actual core concept works because we already have these super users who are attributing their success to this product that I've built in my bedroom, which, to be honest, is still a pretty crappy product. But that's always the best sign. Having a small amount of users who absolutely love what you do is much better than having a big user base who are kind of a little bit nonplussed about your product.
Yeah, I was reading the reviews online and all the students you helped get into top universities, and it was super inspirational. How did you find those initial users?
So getting people to sign up to an app with no credibility, no brand awareness, run by a 21-year-old is not an easy feat. And for any startup, distribution is the thing that kind of makes you stay alive or die in the early days. So I knew I had to sort of growth hack my way to success. So what I did initially, and this sounds incredibly basic and crude nowadays, but I launched Zero Gravity literally by posting an animated video on my own personal Facebook profile. No company profile, just my own personal Facebook profile. Because I had a sort of 1,000 friends on Facebook, which is not a very large number, but was far greater than the 0 followers I had on my company Facebook page. And I thought, even though this isn't perfect, this is my first easy shot at getting distribution. And just from sharing that, I was able to get over 1,000 mentors sign up on the platform in 24 hours. So current university undergraduates who want to support students. And over the course of a couple of months, we got around 150 students in our first cohort who were all from low-income backgrounds and had the ambitions to go to top institutions. So we're not talking incredible large numbers here, but just by doing, finding the kind of path of least resistance, getting that first cohort, and then really, really focusing on getting the customer insights out of those people, that is the thing that really matters in the early days. And that first cohort of 150 users, I literally knew every single one of those people by name because they were not just sort of data points on a platform for me. They were literally my initial customers, and I was speaking to these people on the phone, WhatsApp, because I wanted to know what their experience was using our app. And when you get to a certain size like we are now, you can get all of these fantastic quantitative insights, business intelligence tools, data dashboards. But at the beginning, literally nothing beats picking up the phone and just speaking to your users. It's not sexy. It's not the sort of thing you'll see in a movie about startups. But if you want to get real human insights, you have to create that feedback loop with your users. And that's what I did with that initial cohort.
And what did you discover that they needed most support with?
So the thing I hadn't necessarily taken for granted, but I underestimated, was just the lack of sort of self-confidence and the amount of self-doubt a lot of these students had. And I had a bit of that on my own journey, but I came across these students who they had the most outstanding academic records, despite the fact they came from the really tricky backgrounds. And even with that incredible contextual performance, they still didn't think they were good enough to even give it a go to apply to these institutions. So that was a real insight for me, because it made me think, okay, this problem is not just about kind of navigating people through processes and preparing them. There's actually a huge amount of kind of inspiration and catalyzing that needs to be done here. And that's why I decided to invest so heavy in brand, because I thought this can't just be a great tech product. It has to be a real brand and community that people buy into, because the best way that we're able to create that sort of force of momentum to push these people forward to do things that people in their family and community have never even tried before is almost sort of normalizing it by building this community of people who kind of relate to this journey. So that was a real key insight and informed why I spent so much the early days trying to get that brand identity just right to speak to this very specific audience.
And what's been the biggest challenge for you overall in the journey?
I think at the beginning, not having any money sounds like an obvious challenge, but it is a real challenge. Like, you can go a long way bootstrapped nowadays, and the beauty of building a digital business is you don't have all of these kind of capital expenditures and physical overheads. So you can do a lot with a little, but it was still really tricky to sort of break out of what I call bedroom mode into proper startup mode. And the thing that made the difference for me was I started building that traction. I got that user attribution of people saying this product really does work, even though it was a small cohort. But what I really focused on then was turning that into a kind of brand awareness flywheel that could help me start to generate not only revenue, but investment as well. So when I sort of look back and pinpoint the exact moment, around the end of February 2019, a bunch of the stories of students who used the platform were profiled across the UK press. Didn't happen by accident. I'd sort of worked with these students to build these case studies. I was speaking to journalists. I was harassing people on social media and email to sort of get these newspapers and publications to speak to me. And they all loved the stories because not only did it tap into a kind of zeitgeist of an issue that people were talking about, but because they were real human interest stories, they were like inherently, really, really compelling. So at the end of February, we had BBC News, The Times, The Telegraph, ITV News, like all of these big publications suddenly covered what I was doing. And that was a game changer because suddenly my brand awareness went from being tiny to suddenly, millions of impressions overnight. And then in my inbox, literally I'd have, companies, investors who suddenly wanted to speak to me rather than the other way around. So I always advise founders, like when you're building something, try and work out like what your story is that you're trying to tell. And it may take you a bit of time before you have the right kind of assets to be able to create that PR flywheel. But if you can create a PR flywheel, whether it's in newspapers or having people talk about you on their own social media channels, that is the thing which most easily scales brand awareness from zero to something. And if you can do that, you can start to reverse the kind of system where you have to go to the people to make results happen. Like you almost become magnetic. Like you have good things that almost happen to you by accident. You become a lucky individual, but the way that luck is being created is by creating that flywheel that brings people to you rather than you going to people. And that is the thing. If I had to really pinpoint what got me out of bedroom mode, that's the thing that made all the difference.
I love that. And now you've raised over £6 million for the company. How has your leadership kind of qualities changed from kind of as you grow?
Yeah. Well, I first raised money when I was 22 years old, so July 2019. So we raised a sort of pre-seed round of funding, which is around 425k as a whole. And then around 2 years later, we raised 3.5 million. And then we've raised another sort of 2.5 plus since then. So I've been on a journey when it comes to investment. And like, to be completely honest, at the beginning, when it came to actually hiring my first employee and sort of building a team, I didn't really know what to do because not only had I never managed anyone ever before, but to be honest, I just wasn't intrinsically interested in the concepts of leadership and management. I was an introvert. I was very at home in terms of reading research, building products, and I've been sat in my bedroom, typing away at the keyboard. The idea of how do you actually identify top talent and get results for others was not something I'd ever really thought about before. So like what I did is I kind of was self-aware at least that I was not only a novice in what I was doing, but was incredibly unprepared. And I just spent a lot of time reading books and literature about how to build great teams and get results through others. And one of the things that I sort of most inspired me at the beginning was I read the sort of Netflix book on building culture, which has, I suppose, become a totemic piece of literature in terms of startup culture building. But that really inspired me because it made me think, actually, what kind of company do I want to build? Like, what are the values of this company, the mission, the key behaviors, the key kind of ways of working? And that these shouldn't be sort of corporate things stuck on a PowerPoint. They should be things that are deeply kind of embedded into the psyche of your company. And I sort of did that work early doors to actually define those things and get them clear in my head. And by doing that, I was able to essentially hire people who fitted that mold. So you've got to put in the work. If you're a sort of early stage founder like me, you've never done this before, don't just passively walk into the situation of hiring employees and assume you're going to start scaling and getting great results early doors. Getting human beings to work together collaboratively is actually really, really difficult. But when you can make it work, you can go so much faster than you can ever do alone. But you have to be sort of proactive about it. You can't passively walk into a situation like that.
What does success mean to you?
So the kind of driver and motivator for me was never money. I think people are all very dismissive nowadays of people who have financial motivations for starting companies, which I think is very unfair, because if you are somebody from especially a low income background, the desire to kind of escape your economic circumstances and be autonomous is a kind of real noble ambition from my point of view. But like, money was never a massive motivator. I wanted to kind of be successful and have enough to be able to get by, but I didn't care about having a sort of super yacht or a Lamborghini to show off on my Instagram account. I think the thing that was the kind of driver for me is I had a bit of a chip on my shoulder because I'd seen this problem firsthand. I knew there was thousands of students like me who are being kind of overlooked and underestimated every year. And it was almost that chippiness that made me feel, I want to do something about this and become known as the person who's actually tackled this problem firsthand and innovated to try and solve a problem which is as old as societies have ever existed. This social mobility has been a problem for tens of thousands of years. So I suppose I just wanted to be someone who could solve this problem I'd sort of saw firsthand. And that was the big driver for me. And I think when you're building a startup, it's so difficult, especially in the early days, because you've got so many knockbacks. No one believes in what you're doing. Success is few and far between. You've got to work out what that kind of burning flame inside you is. And sometimes it can be escaping something negative as much as it can be running towards something positive. And that chippiness for me, trying to solve a problem for future generations of students like me, sort of tapping into some of that adversity I faced growing up and thinking, I want to make sure other people don't fall into this as well. That was the motivator and driver. So that might not necessarily be a kind of fairy tale motivation, but that was the thing that kept me.
Within your company, how do you measure success? What are the metrics you look at?
So you can't change the world overnight. So one of your biggest decisions as a startup founder is to work out how to create a clear sense of focus within your company. So you've got to be really disciplined, and almost, if you think of your business as almost like a network or a tree, you've got to find the point in that network where if you're able to push that in the right direction, it's going to kind of have second order effects on everything else. Because if you have 1,000,001 different KPIs and things that you're measuring and following, then you don't really have any focus. Like the K in KPI stands for key. So if you've got 100 KPIs, none of them are really KPIs. So for me, in the early days, we really focused initially on like acquisition in our product, because no users, no product at the end of the day. So the first thing I focused on was building this system to try and identify talented people from low income backgrounds. And essentially what we did is we used a bunch of public and private data sets, and we built an algorithm to kind of mathematically calculate whether students A, were from a low income background, and B, if they were particularly talented versus the resources they had growing up. And that was the first thing I concentrated on. So at the beginning, we just focused on acquisition. Are you consistently and scalably recruiting the right people? Nowadays, we're far more focused on retention. We know we've got these acquisition channels. We know we can sign students up. We know we can get them to use our app. How do we actually keep them consistently engaged for the long run. If you have a cool, shiny product, it's really easy to get engagement from users, maybe in the first 24 hours or even the first week. And that's what many people in product would call your kind of activation rate, and how many of your users do a kind of meaningful task after they sign up. Trying to keep people engaged for the long term, that is in many ways the ultimate challenge of any digital app, especially social apps. And when you look at apps like TikTok, for instance, they're absolute masters of creating that long-term retention over time, almost to the point where people are addicted and the societal consequences that come out of that. But for an app like Zero Gravity, that's something that nowadays we focus on, because I know if we're able to drive deep long-term engagement amongst users, that ricochets to everything else, whether it's brand awareness, commercials, driving revenue. So I would countenance anyone building a startup, don't focus on everything. Find that sort of key point in network that will power everything else, and just focus absolutely relentlessly on solving that problem. One big problem, if you're going to start a company, you want to be talking about the same thing every single time, in terms of, I know if I can shift the dial on this, it's going to solve everything else. You've got to find what that is at each stage of your journey.
Reading a case on a homeless person as well that you supported.
Yeah,
they got into Cambridge, I think.
And we've had people from backgrounds which are far more adverse than my own. So like for these people, trying to find them and identify them really, really matters. Like it may be a data point on a screen, a kind of acquisition number, but behind each one of those data points is a real living, breathing human being who often is in really difficult circumstances, and Zero Gravity potentially could be the thing that puts them on a different trajectory. So acquisition for us is not just a kind of vanity metric. It's actually really meaningful in terms of spotting this sort of under-recognized talent in the UK who, if they do use the app, could potentially go on a completely different journey that would not have happened otherwise. So it's quite personal getting those acquisition numbers up.
Yeah, and of course you are tackling this problem, but what do you think society as a whole can do more of, or what change does the education system need so there's more social mobility?
Well, historically, we've seen the biggest jumps in social mobility when there's been profound economic change. People tend to think that changes in inequality is driven by politics, government policy, reforms, political figures, great speeches. Often it's not the case. We see the big jumps in social mobility when there's a big economic change. So go back in time, the first big boost in social mobility is when you started to see the agricultural revolution, because suddenly you got all of these subsistence farmers who could only grow enough crops to feed their own family start to create a surplus and sell that surplus, and that meant more people could move to market towns and do kind of different styles of non-agricultural jobs. And social mobility was still really bad in the kind of medieval middle age periods, and it really difficult to go from a working class background to be a member of the aristocracy, almost impossible. But there was some degree of social mobility created by that. The next big jump, the Industrial Revolution. Now, suddenly you've got all these people moving from rural towns into cities. And even though there was no really difficult conditions in the cities, it did create this new urban middle class where you could have people whose parents had been agricultural workers suddenly able to sort of create their own small business or become a highly skilled person working a factory. So things were far from perfect, but suddenly you got these big urban middle classes which you just didn't have before.
How do you think Oxford and studying PPE helps you now with your startup? What are some of the kind of transferable skills you've learned, or something you've learned in your education that you've taken forward?
Yeah, you're right to point out the issue with debt, because UK has one of the most expensive higher education systems in the world. The US is very expensive as well, but the big difference between the UK and US is scholarships. In the UK, the average student graduates with around 50k of student debt, and if you're from a low-income background, you're likely to have even more debt because you don't have any money from the bank of mum and dad to sort of allow you to take less loans throughout your degree. In the US, because a lot of the US colleges are so economically powerful, if you go to one of these Ivy League schools and your household income is below 150k per year, often you can get a full ride scholarships. Now that sounds crazy in the UK. 150k per year is an absolutely gargantuan salary by UK standards. But because US colleges have so much more financial firepower, they can be far more generous in the scholarships they give to students. So university is a really big economic undertaking in the UK. And that's why I think it's so dangerous that we've got to a point where there's around a fifth of students in the UK who go to university who actually end up worse off than had they never gone to university in the first place when you look at the data. When you look at the more selective universities like Oxbridge, there is a lot of data showing that going to those universities is a very good financial decision. If you go to an Oxbridge university, it boosts your lifetime earnings by around £400,000 versus going to kind of the average level university in the UK. So the return on investment is very clear. And when I bring that into my own personal life, I think Oxford made me look credible on paper. Like there's a huge amount of signaling value in these university brands. Like before Oxford, I was just Joe, the 18-year-old from a sort of small post-industrial town in the UK. And now I'm Joe, the Oxford University graduate. And it sounds crude and hollow, but these university brands like really do like change how you're perceived by people. So I think there was the signaling effect. I mean, I think the other thing that really made a difference is the network it builds as well. Like universities, especially the selective ones, are kind of like these bubbling cauldrons of talent. Like you're meeting all of these motivated, intelligent people, a lot of people also from more wealthy backgrounds, and suddenly you build this incredible network around you that you may take for granted when you're 21 years old. But when you start to get into your late 20s and suddenly all these people are getting into positions of power and influence, it actually allows you to be able to do stuff that was otherwise locked off from you. So I think Oxbridge is particularly good at building those long-term networks as well, which is why people, they probably rightly complain that certain industries like politics, journalism, banking and law almost has a kind of vice grip of Oxbridge. We've got all these people who all know each other, all in these positions of power. And that's not by accident. It's because networks really do make a difference in terms of people's career growth.
Honestly, Joe, it's been amazing talking to you, and I can go on forever, but we do need to wrap up. We have our last 3 questions that we ask every guest. First one being, we are filming in a cafe, which is what makes this podcast unique. What's your go-to coffee break drink?
Oh, I'm really boring, so I have a flat white. But because I grew up in the north of England, I didn't actually drink coffee until I was sort of like 18 years old, because in the north, everyone just drinks breakfast tea. So if you were to ask me, I was going to a coffee shop, I'd much prefer a sort of like builder's breakfast tea than some kind of swanky coffee, to be honest.
But flat white's my go-to as well. And this podcast is all about connection. It's Kasa Connect. How can our audience and listeners get in touch with you, and what's something that you'd want from them?
So if you're a student, either at school or university, and you're someone who is from a background where it's not normal to sort of defy the odds, then the Zero Gravity website is the place to go. zerogravity.co.uk, got to shout out that one. Otherwise, very happy to speak to any budding entrepreneurs on LinkedIn. Now, my journey to this point wasn't easy. I made a lot of mistakes, and I'm only here today because of certain people ahead of me on the journey who were able to give me their time and expertise to help me defy the odds. So I feel a sort of moral responsibility to give back to any early stage founders. So if you're someone who's got a business idea, you're struggling to get it off the ground, and you want to think, how do you build that traction, that product love, that PR flywheel, please do feel free to reach out to me, because I love to meet interesting young people trying to make a difference.
Who's been your biggest source of support? I'm just curious.
I think the very first investor in my company was incredibly powerful. He's a guy called Bill. I met him completely by chance. He read about what I was doing in the Sunday Times. He cold emailed me. He met me in the pub. I didn't know who he was. We just had a pint at the beginning. But he put the first £100,000 into Zero Gravity. And more so than that, he spent the first 2 years like really working closely with me to sort of develop and mentor me as an entrepreneur. Now, he'd built his own business, which he'd scaled from a university laboratory to a public company in the UK. So he'd been on that entrepreneurial journey. He knew what it took. And it was his kind of time, attention and support that enabled me to move faster in my development than I could have gone alone. And there's been countless people they're like that who've helped me across the journey. But if I was to pinpoint one person who made a massive difference, now he was there right at the beginning and really shaped me into the entrepreneur that I am today.
That's amazing. And lastly, what's the best piece of advice that you regret not taking?
Regret not taking? Trying to think what I stubbornly ignored at the beginning, but has become a home truth. I think I can't necessarily summarize this into a pithy quote, but I do think one of the big requirements for any entrepreneur once you start building a team is you have to seek conflict. I was somebody who didn't necessarily like conflict. I wanted to kind of be, respectful and reasonable. As a young founder, I felt I couldn't be unreasonable.
Yeah.
But I've learned over time that if you want to make stuff happen, if you want to create that kind of dynamism in your company, you've got to constantly be seeking constructive conflict in terms of being unreasonable and pushing that person. People always push back on you and say, I don't have enough time to do this, or this is why this didn't happen. And as a reasonable person, naturally, you always want to understand their motivations and reasons and blah, 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 blah. And you have to listen, but you also have to be unreasonable as well, because you can't set high expectations without being a somewhat unreasonable person. So if you have people in your company looking at you and saying, I really respect this founder, he's got a clear vision, he's super passionate, but he's a bit of a pain in the arse sometimes, he's a bit unreasonable, I'd actually say that's the perfect equilibrium. You don't want to be that person that everyone loves and thinks is an easygoing, nice, easy person to work with, because that means you're not setting the expectation high enough. And that's something I didn't necessarily realize right at the start of my journey.
I absolutely love that one. Thank you so much, Joe. It's been a pleasure speaking to you.
Great to be on the pod.